So do you want to remind me just the subject of the question? I'll remember it once you remind me.
One sec. I'll do my best.
Just the subject, actually.
The subject was dealing with the ego. Dealing with the ego and the personality upon death. And yet, was it Trisha's experience of being able to communicate with the personality of her friend Ted,
Mm-hmm.
not embodied?
Mm-hmm.
My understanding was, from when we describe the white light and the filters and whatnot, we go back to the white light or to the nothingness or to source or to oneness. But from that experience and from several other experiences from other folks, at the moment of death, I understand you to say that or have understood you to say, and maybe I'm wrong yet again of that, that the personality and the ego don't. I mean, they go with the body.
Mm-hmm.
Versus the experience of others that are saying that person's personality, who I'm communicating, who has passed on or gone to the other side or whatever the language is.
Mm-hmm.
Shed some light on that, if you would. Did that circle back around a bit?
So once again, the teaching is a set of concepts, not necessarily truth. So in a way, we could say what that means is a set of concepts means it's a story that has been created to explain life. And the story is not necessarily the only story that could be used to explain life. But and so I'd like to look at the concepts as accurate concepts. Accurate enough that they deliver peace of mind, or useful as they are, story, or they're not truth. Nothing is truth. No teaching is truth. But they are more than sufficient, in my experience, to create a clear seeing, which allows a being of who we are. So to that extent, we can relate to them as accurate. So I'll share a story about something that happened recently. My pet dog that I've had for 11 years passed away. I got a phone call and he wasn't feeling well, and so went to the vet, and the vet said he had a stomach tumor. And the vet said it's very feasible to put him down at this point. And so I took the advice and I said, okay, let's euthanize George. His name was George. But I wasn't there. I wasn't, I couldn't really make a decision based on my own feel of the situation. I was just relying on what the vet said, and my flatmate or housemate that was looking after the situation. And that night after he had been put down, I had one of these dreams that maybe I wouldn't even call a dream, very vivid, almost like an experience rather than a dream. And my relationship to dreams is that actually it's an experience in consciousness, and it's only when we wake up that we say, oh, that was a dream. That in practice, a dream and the waking state are no different. When I say in practice, in principle maybe is a better word. That this is an arising in a consciousness that is aware of what arises. That's life and experience. And when a dream arises, essentially this experience collapses and a new experience takes its place. How we relate to dreams is how dreams appear. Once the dream collapses and this experience reappears, it appears with us lying in a bed, and then it feels like, oh, I was dreaming. If we drop all of that and are present with the experience, we find this experience of life and the experience we call a dream are no different. Their content arising in consciousness that recognizes the content. The only reason that a dream appears like a dream is that there's no continuity. The content is random, not random, but it doesn't fit in line with what's happening in daily life. If we start dreaming about our daily life, and the content of the dream was in the house that we live in, and we were doing normal things like walking around and writing letters or tidying cupboards, we would get very confused. Because in the dream we might put something in a cupboard, and then, because it's the same environment, we would not be able to tell what was a dream and what was real life, which starts to show the unreality of life. But I don't like using the word unreal because it implies that the mind can take it too seriously and then start to deny the experience or reduce the experience down too far. But it's useful to see that, this is actually an experience in consciousness, like a dream, an experience in consciousness. And when it ends, it goes to nothing. And so in deep sleep each night, the theory is that the world, the universe, our house, the body, completely collapses. Even in a dream, this experience collapses. There's no one sleeping in a bed. There is no bed. There is no house. There's no earth. There's no universe. What takes its place is the dream. And then the dream collapses, and this comes back in a way that appears like it was always here. So anyway, that's why dreams don't seem like this, but in principle they're the same. Anyhow, so I had a dream, which is an experience, and if I meet someone that has died in what we call daily life, in a dream, to me, I've met them again. So someone that I care about who's passed away, there have been dreams where I meet them, and the experience is of, wow, I'm hugging them and feeling emotions of love. And in the morning, I don't necessarily wake up and go, oh, that was just a dream. It's like, oh, I met Ramesh last night. And I mean it. Like, if I met him now, it would be the same as in the dream. There would be certain feelings and what have you. And so in this experience/dream, George came running up to me. He was a golden lab retriever and was jumping over me. And he's got this fairly thick mane sort of thing. And I was rubbing his mane, and she likes. And he was licking me and jumping all over me. And I said, oh, he's perfectly well. He doesn't need to be put down. And then at some point it became like the dream started to change, and it became apparent, oh, he's already been put down, he's dead. And so that having happened could easily be interpreted by me as, oh, that's George. It was a significant thing for me. It was like a sign that he was happy, and and so it was a very nice experience. But it didn't mean to me that I believe George exists somewhere else. That would be an extra implication that I make about the experience. So to the extent it's an experience, yes, there is an interaction with George, but who interacts with who? It's like a dream, it's a creation. It doesn't mean that there is a George just because he's in the experience. And similarly, there are people that have experiences of communicating with, it all depends on the language. They say, I communicate with the dead who are on the other side. And really what it is an experience that they have in this moment, and the implication that the mind makes that if my grandfather is talking to me, that my grandfather must be over there, and he is very much alive, is a big extrapolation, a big assumption onto what the experience really means. Which doesn't mean that doesn't mean they're lying, it doesn't mean that they're imagining something, it means that they're having that experience, and it's destined for the experience to be exactly that. And so some people have those experiences regularly, and they would say, it makes sense to me, I would say, oh, in that case I would call myself a medium, right? I mean, looking at it this way, I might not say I'm a medium, because a medium might imply that I am talking to someone on the other side. But different mediums might have different ideas about what is actually going on. And the fact, if someone says, a medium told me that my grandfather has told me to go and dig a hole next to the tree in the back garden because there is gold buried there. And I went and dug a hole exactly where the medium told me, and there was gold there. So now I'm absolutely convinced that my grandfather exists on the other side. That is based on seeing life a particular way, as an objective reality with a here and a there, and a me that is an independent, objective reality, and someone else who is independent and objective. Whereas if I see life as an experience happening right now, a story of cause and effect, of time and space, then all of the causes and all of the effects are part of the story. And it doesn't surprise me that the story, which is infinitely creative, can include a voice of someone that used to be in the story, telling me to go and look somewhere. I go and do it, and lo and behold, the story includes gold being there, let's say. So it's just about our assumption about what that implies about what life is and what death is. So you're correct. On the base concept says that when the body dies, the impersonal consciousness of Source no longer has a vehicle to function through, and so Source is no longer able to express itself in a personal way, and another vehicle needs to come into existence for Source to link through and express through that new form. And so I've said that to me, death is the end. When the body dies, there is no more personal experience of Roger. Roger no longer has a personal experience. That's to try and demonstrate what life is and what death is. So life is consciousness in movement, or an experience in the present moment, and death would be the experience returning back to its resting state of nothing, ready to remanifest as a new experience. I'm open to the fact that the story of life may go like this. Roger is stabbed, and over the course of a minute or two starts to feel the life draining out of him, and oh wow, this is how I'm going to die. And then the lights go out. And according to what I've said, the lights are out and that's it. Right? But I don't hold that as a belief. I hold it as a concept that is what life has demonstrated to me, and said, this is accurate enough, because while you hold this concept, suffering doesn't arise. Suffering is based on a misunderstanding of oneself, a misunderstanding of what life is. To the extent that suffering doesn't arise, we can conclude there isn't a misunderstanding of oneself and life, and therefore the concepts that are held in such a way that they don't create a misunderstanding, and they're also accurate enough to allow peace or understanding to remain. But I'm open to the fact that I might get stabbed. In theory, lights out, but in practice, I might find myself sitting in a waiting room, in God's waiting room. And I might, oh, this is strange, where am I? And then I look down and I see the knife sticking out, and I realize, oh, my body is a little bit more ghost-like or less form. And so I would say, oh, I must be dead. But I wouldn't say I must be dead. What I would really say is, oh, this is a new experience, and it's still life. So I haven't died. This is life carrying on, the story of life. just now on a different dimension, let's say, to the life that was before. But it's not life after death, because to me there is life and death. And death is absolute nothing, no experience. Life is experience. So what that is just a transition in the story of life, from life on earth to life in God's waiting room. And understanding what life is, which is life is an experience, recognized, witnessed by a awareness that is aware of the experience. That understanding, I suspect, would still be there in God's waiting room. That says, oh, this is experience, recognized by consciousness that is aware of the experience. And if I walk into the room and there's God sitting on a throne, the understanding is that's not really God. That's a character in life. And the Roger with a knife sticking out of his chest is a character in life, and this is just a continuation of the story. And God says, you did a very bad job. I suspect I might say, well, in what regard? And he said, well, you could have fought off the attacker a little bit more than you did. So yeah, in theory it's true. I was very slow and he got me. But the guilt for being slow wouldn't be there, assuming the understanding is the same. That the experience there is still an experience created not by me. The character Roger is in the experience, and Roger can't be guilty. God, there isn't a God that will ever judge me. So I just put in an end at death, because why not? It's a good place to say it goes from life experience to nothing. If there's different that's no more reality than this. It's not suddenly I've died and now I'm in reality. There is no reality except for experience. And then experience always collapses into no experience. It's just the nature of what experience is.
Thank you. A lot of that got cleared up, but there's still one bit of residue. I think I'm still hung up on the fact of the original explanation, or the way I took it, that the personality or the ego dies with the body, but from this new explanation, this new experience, the body got dropped and is in the waiting room, and Roger's still having a Roger experience in that form. So
what it means in this is that, okay, a new body vehicle is created.
But it's still sorry.
It would be, if this is why, it gets complicated to now start talking about what traditionally we would call life after death. But if we assume that is what happens, and that's not my base assumption, but if we assume that that's what happens, then there would be still the description that impersonal consciousness has linked to a particular body, functioning through that body as personal consciousness. And the body in that situation would just be a more ephemeral body, let's say, that is very much linked to the previous body on Earth. So I guess it will look the same and it will have the same personality and characteristics. So in that case, we would say, oh wow, the body that physically was buried or burnt, a sort of clone version of it is created, like an energetic version of it or something like that. But you see, if we bring this in, it starts bringing in the notion that the human can continue. The human in that case only continues because a new body that is very similar to the old body is created in the experience.
It feels like the personality, though, for the lack of a term, transcends or keeps going, whether there's a physical, any kind of form, denser form or not, the energy or the interpretation from source is still through a Rogerness energy.
if it creates a vehicle that is a Roger vehicle, then yes, the expression would be as Rogerness in God's waiting room. But if until it creates another vehicle, there is no Rogerness that is hanging around in the ether somewhere. The Rogerness only exists once the consciousness of Source links to a particular vehicle. And so in the interim, when Roger physical body dies, and in the interim to the experience of Roger in God's waiting room, there is nothing. So there's no Rogerness there. Yeah. Remember, what we're doing is putting concepts here onto life, and the concepts are never going to be truth. So be careful not to hear what I'm saying as this is how it is. But I'm sufficiently convinced based on my own experience saying these are the concepts that are in my system. They are sufficient to undo the misunderstanding, and with them in the system held correctly as concepts, they coincide with peace of mind, which is the end of suffering, which is really the end of misunderstanding who I am and what life is.
I hear you, and so I hesitate to ask this question because it's not necessarily completely important, but when you described the filter of the humanness and then the data that gets transferred from that filter to the next filter, that data has to, I imagine, exist between filters.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And so I'm hearing that there's not a complete collapsing into nothing because there's still an amount of data that holds a certain imprint. And so I would imagine like you don't have like a physical form or anything, but there is still some formless entity without needing to be too specific, but
because these are concepts trying to describe something very amorphous or multi-dimensional, we'll always find shortcomings in the metaphors, effectively. They're metaphors. So a metaphor is never going to be perfect. So of course there's a cloud, right? Where the data gets stored. So that's one explanation, that the data, when the body dies, a certain type of data, which is the unresolved desires and fears and talents and insights, comes out and is held as just energy, not as a person or a personality, but just a particular set of data. And it goes into the cloud and it's stored on the cloud. And then when a new incarnation is born, and so this implies that the cloud is there, which means that it doesn't go to nothing because there's a cloud. A cloud plus the rest of the universe, let's say, doing everything that's happening. So, but the consciousness, the personal consciousness of Jane, let's say, if Jane was the one that died, that doesn't exist anymore, so that has gone to nothing. The rest of it is still there, let's say. We could look at it another way and see that a dream can arise, and we can have a dream at night, and then it collapses to nothing. It's no longer there. But then the next night, another dream can arise, but it can seem like it's a continuation of the first dream. It could be, the dream carries on. So the appearance is that there was a something in between, but actually what is in the second dream is completely fresh. So the data that is said in the new incarnation, the data that is said to come from a previous incarnation, doesn't necessarily come from a previous incarnation. It's just created in the present moment to appear like it came from before. Because the fact is there a before, or is there just now? So these concepts are going to have their limitations. Your question is very valid because it allows us, hopefully our mind can start thinking more laterally than just linearly, and that's the opening up of the mind to start seeing life in a much less linear fashion than we tend to see it as. We tend to see it as life is cause and effect, and so if we hear God created everything, then the automatic question is, so who created God? And what we're maybe doing is projecting a certain assumption of the nature of life onto God, which is prior to cause and effect. And so then we can say, that question, who created God, is not a valid question necessarily, because it's a question that presupposes a cause for every effect. So if we say there's God, then the presupposition based on a linear assumption of what life is that if there's God, there must be a creator of God. If we realize that outside of the manifestation, the laws may be very, very different, then maybe that question is based on laws that don't apply outside the manifestation. So our mind needs to start going, I don't know. I don't know is basically a very useful part of the process, where we start seeing all these concepts that I hold as truth, all of these ways of thinking are very limited, really. They're very relative. They're ways of thinking that a relative brain is doing, and the brain with very relative information. And so at some point, this is where we realize teachings are only ever concepts, and my ideas about what is just a perception. And it's like, I don't know. So even in relation to guilt and blame and pride, the power of I don't know is that it cuts off our stories. Because our stories, and I don't mean the story of life, I mean the stories of doership, let's say. The stories based on a misunderstanding of who we are and what life is. Those stories are based on a belief, I am the doer. I do need things to be a certain way, and so therefore I hate you for what you've done, and that blame can keep carrying on and carrying on. And if we've started to realize, actually, I don't know. I don't even know that I should blame them. So I don't know is sort of a little outside of the conceptual framework that we've been putting forward today. But it effectively has the same effect of cutting off suffering by seeing it for what it is, relative and not necessarily truth.
So can we look at, the state, like when my body drops, this data that's, I don't know, can you look at it as your essence or your soul?
No.
No.
But, you can, but please don't. That's not how it's implied
because
here.
Because it sounds like, even though, this data, when it incarnates, is it the same data that just incarnates lifetime to lifetime?
Okay, so it's a good question. Let's look at an example of what this data would be, because it's being defined as unresolved fears, unresolved desires, unresolved talents, and loosely again I'll say insights. And so unresolved fears could be an example if a person gets attacked by a pack of dogs, and that's painful, the situation is painful, and let's say it creates a trauma based on a psychological relationship to what happened, where the person is feels attacked on a fundamental level, probably because their identification is with being the biological only. And so that attack, that event, creates a general fear or anxiety either towards dogs or towards life in general. And that is a psychological, so that's part of the identity of doership and attachment to outcomes, based on an event that happened. The event itself was painful, but what gets locked away is our holding on to the event and what it meant about a me. Right? And the same, we can look at blame. If someone was very unfairly treated in life and they held a lot of resentment and blame to their captors or their people that were treating them unfairly, the event might finish, they might be freed, and yet the blame can be ongoing. Right? So this is suffering. And then when that person dies, what is said to stay is that load of blame, that load of worry, which includes in it basically all of the beliefs of doership and attachment to outcome. So that load, that energetic load, is the belief in doership. And so when a new body is born, if it's their destiny, they will get a handful, maybe part of that energetic load or the whole thing, a handful that becomes part of their genes and up-to-date conditioning, which means they might find themselves blaming people easily, because as part of what they've come into this life with is a predisposition because of this unresolved blame that was carried over from another life, not their life, but some other life. They might find themselves predisposed to being very judgmental and blaming of people. They might find themselves unexplainably afraid of dogs or fearful of life. And so maybe we can see that that load that was carried over was just data that is not that personal. It's more an attitude rather than a personality. And so it comes in, and that is what will then be part of the person's genes and up-to-date conditioning, which will affect their psychological relationship or their attitude to what happens in the flow of life. It will then mean that something like patterns will repeat themselves, so they might be afraid of dogs and they may well get attacked by dogs. That could be their destiny, because fear can tend to be taken as weakness or as an attack on the dog. Like fear can be, you're not good enough, I'm afraid of you. And that can engender a response from a dog. So a pattern can repeat itself. And if that happens, then the fear will become even more ingrained. And so that's how the pattern tends to get stronger until such time as life starts to undo the patterns.
And so if a person is able to see that and resolve all their fears and everything, what happens to that data when the body drops?
Once the fear is seen, it gets released. That's this whole process of seeing doership. Means it's no longer believed that I am the doer, the other is the doer, and it's like I can't blame that person. I can't see them as an independent doer anymore. And the blame will dissolve. The process by which it dissolves is usually by it being cathartically released through the body. And with this understanding, cathartic release can happen, understanding it's just an old way of seeing life. It's an old set of events that have been locked away. So the catharticness can happen, and a witnessing of this energy as something impersonal, something that feels very personal, but actually is something that happened, can be seen, and it leaves the body. We then find that our relationship to life miraculously is very different once that energy leaves the body. We can't explain it. Well, we can explain it theoretically, is that the person now on a biological and psychological level is very different, because that energy that was contained as part of their genes and up-to-date conditioning has been released. And so then they find that they go through life continuing to be pleasure and pain, but the reaction on a biological, or more likely on an attitudinal level, is radically different. So once that is transformed, that doership energy, into cathartic energy and then just dissolves into the universe. When the body dies, that energy is no longer there to be stored as data. So effectively in life, we're either having our load added to, so our attitude of doership is either being added to, or at some point it starts to dissolve the load. And if all of the load is dissolved in a particular lifetime, then the theory is that there is no energy to be reincarnated unless you look at insight as being one of the energies that say. So in theory you could say that a load of data that is just insight can be inserted in a new incarnation, which would mean, let's say, the theory of a Dalai Lama maybe, is that they are born with very little unresolved desires and fears and unresolved talents, and maybe born with a lot of insight, which is why at a young age of 3 or 4 or 6 or whatever, they might be able to start holding discourse with much older monks and unexplainably, be able to hold the floor.
Thank you.
So all this talk on this topic reminded me of something that I read by Nisargadatta. Somebody asked Nisargadatta a question like, so what will happen to you when you die? And he said something to the effect, I'm already dead.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, I'm double dead.
Yeah.
What do you think he meant by that? I'd like to hear your take on that.
He, my take on it is that he was referring to the entity that was, the identity that was in this teaching would be referred to as the belief in personal doership and attachment to outcome, or in other teachings it would be the me, let's say, or that this process kills that, it dissolves that. And from that place you can say there's nobody here. That's another teaching. It's not what this teaching says. It's actually, remember, all teachings are concepts. It's not particularly accurate in my view to say there is nobody here, but it's very, very useful and accurate and powerful as a methodology to dissolve a certain belief that we carry around. So if someone says to Nisargadatta, what happens when you die, the question to him won't even make sense, because the question is being asked by someone who is presupposing the existence of the same identity that they have of themselves and projecting that onto Nisargadatta and saying, oh, well, this is who I see myself as, so you must be the same. So what happens when you die? And he says, no, don't superimpose your idea of yourself onto me. I don't have that idea of myself. That idea of myself has already died. In fact, it died so hard, it's double dead. And so in the context of this teaching says the ego will always be there. The ego is the body and the name and form, the personality and all that. And that doesn't dissolve, it doesn't change. Jesus was an ego, Ramana was an ego, Ramesh was an ego, Buddha was an ego, until the death of the body. So the death of the body is the death of the ego, which is very different use of the word ego to what is how it's traditionally used. It will go further and say that there is an ego with the belief in personal doership and attachment to outcome. And then after this process, there is an ego without the belief in personal doership and attachment to outcome. So in practice, when we see what has actually died, it is the belief in personal doership and attachment to outcome. And it's died because there is a recognition of the fundamental nature of life as an experience. And once life is seen as an experience and the individual is seen to be just part of an experience, the beliefs that say, I am essentially this, limited to this, those beliefs no longer have ground to stand on. And seeing myself as essentially this means that there is the belief that I, as this separate entity, must be the doer. And from my experience, if I see myself as physical, pleasure is what adds to me and pain is what takes away from me. The realization of our true nature, that formless consciousness, means we see, what I am is always complete, never added to or subtracted from by pleasure or pain. And as that formless consciousness, I know myself as the witness and not the creator. Formless consciousness has the function of witnessing, not creating.
Yeah, thank you. That covers it.
You're welcome.
So you've been saying that this teaching is a set of concepts. I guess all teachings are a set of concepts. And that by being open to or grasping these, I guess, more accurate concepts, we can use them to, like as in the example with the thorn, debunk the old concepts that we held about what we are and who we are. Namely that we are limited, that we are this body-mind and separate, and that we are the doer. Mm-hmm. So once I guess I'm trying to understand, because there's a lot of focus on what we are not, as in like, I am not the doer. And the concepts are being used to reveal what we are not, in essence. Mm-hmm. So once that has been thoroughly investigated, then what remains or what is revealed is that true nature, which is beyond the concepts. Is that correct?
Yeah. So there are pointers to what we are, but primarily you're spot on that there's more emphasis on pointing as to what the error is. Freedom is the dissolving of the error, not the creating of who I am. So it's like taking rocks out of a hole. We don't need to create the hole, we just need to take the rocks out of it and then the hole is there. And in the same way, if what we're not is seen, or the beliefs that say I am this, if they start to be seen as not so accurate, they fall away and then there's no creating that needs to happen. No, we don't have to rebuild who we are. Who we are is already there, it's just covered up. So putting too much effort into describing what we are maybe isn't necessary.
So understanding these concepts, because I feel like it's a lot of concepts that I'm trying to grasp.
Concepts, yeah.
So, but the more, the significance of understanding the concepts is because the more I understand, the more effectively I can use them to dismantle the old concepts. Is that
yes, except what we come to see is that you, as a doer, don't use the concepts, but rather the concepts become part of what you are on a biological level, and then there is an automatic functioning of your biologicalness, which includes the functioning of thinking that will unfold according to the conceptual framework. So automatically, if the concepts become part of your makeup, you won't be able to help but live life as you normally live life. And if you find that you've lost $50 out of your wallet, as soon as there's awareness of the fact $50 has gone missing, the thought might arise, this is pain in the moment. This is financial pain in the moment, right? Which historically we've seen as that's me thinking, that's my thought. If we come to see that actually that is just thought happening based on the circumstance, that inspires a certain reaction in the body. That reaction is this thought, this is financial pain in the moment. And then the thought could carry on. That my happiness, my completeness is never to be found in the absence of pain or the presence of pleasure. And that thought might cut off any suffering that arose for a period of time when it was believed, oh, this is an attack on who I am. The fact I've lost $50 is an attack on who I am. And so we might start to see that the investigation is a happening, just like the conceptual framework being ingrained in your body is a happening. It's happening right now. No one is doing it. A bit like getting sunburnt. Go out in the sun and burning happens.
So is it not as important then to not examine, but like earlier, I guess the conversation kind of confused me when we were talking about, well, awareness versus consciousness, and is awareness always present and that kind of stuff, like, because these are again concepts that I cannot verify experientially for myself.
Which ones? When we start talking about the esoteric concepts of awareness not being aware in deep sleep, for example, it's true that's something that's harder to verify for yourself. But a lot of the concepts we're talking about in the main teachings, which don't talk so much about awareness being present in deep sleep or not, the ones that talk about practical daily living are very easy to investigate for yourself. So the notion that the flow of life, which is this is very key, the flow of life is only ever pleasure or pain. Pleasure, if it's what is unfolding, is in line with my biological preferences. Pain, if what is unfolding is out of line with my biological preferences. So then it's a matter of living life and seeing, is it true that in this moment it's only pleasure or pain? And is it true that it's pleasure or pain because of the circumstance and how it relates to my biological preferences? And is it true that my biological preferences are a result of my genes and up-to-date conditioning that I had no control over? And so that contemplation, which will happen when it happens, is actually something that anyone can do just by looking at their own life experience.
But that contemplation, again, is more to do with seeing that I'm not the doer.
Because the only thing that gets in the way of our true nature and our happiness is that that action of the human, that reaction of the human, of guilt, blame, pride, worry, and expectation.
Okay, thank you.
So when it's put in that context, actually the spiritual search can become very narrow and focused. So we might come to see, I've been meditating, let's say, as a practice because I believe that meditation is, the answer. And we might see, I was just believing that I have to become a good meditator. I have to be the best meditator. I have to meditate 3 hours a day. Or I might find myself thinking that it's all about breathing and full body orgasms, or there's all sorts of different things that people associate with liberation or the spiritual transformation. When we ask that question, what am I really looking for? In practical terms, if I drop all of these ideas about what it's about. Let me even drop the idea that I'm interested in enlightenment. What am I really interested in? Why do I want enlightenment? We want enlightenment because we think it's going to make us happy, or give us something, give us something that will make us happy. I will be one with God and then I'll be happy. So let's keep it simple. I just want to be happy. I don't care how it happens. I just want to be happy. So let me look at what my unhappiness is. And then we go through this process and we see, actually, if I keep my focus on that, I can drop so many things that I've been doing in life, practicing, trying to be good at, that maybe are not that relevant.
Okay, so trying to synthesize again. So all that ever is actually happening is in the now, or in the present moment. An experience is arising, which I have a certain body mind that is consistent of DNA and up-to-date conditioning. There's a thinking mind that thinks it's the doer and has to figure everything out. There's the working mind. I feel like I'm doing a Venn diagram. But there's the working mind that's working with awareness.
Mm-hmm.
The thinking mind's trying to get in and say, hey, I can help.
Yeah.
Like a little kid sister that follows you around and wants to be around. That's what like my thinking mind feels like these days. And it wants to have a role and a job. And I don't know how to break it to it. But that's probably the thinking mind. Anyway, the working mind seems to be part of the up-to-date conditioning. Is that what you're saying?
The thinking mind is also part of the up-to-date conditioning, but it's the part of the up-to-date conditioning based on the belief of doership and attachment to outcomes. So the reason we separate the two, so generally everything is, both the biological and the psychological, is contained in our genes and up-to-date conditioning. But then we create a separation between the biological and the psychological, because the psychological is the aspect that can change, and it's the aspect that is problematic. So we focus on what is the psychological. It's the belief in doership and attachment to outcome. It's part of the genes and up-to-date conditioning. So when it functions, when it creates suffering, the working mind, the intellectual understanding, hopefully, is sufficient that it will see the thinking mind as just a happening. No one doing it, it's just destined to be there because it's part of the genes and up-to-date conditioning. And to the extent that that's seen, it means that it's seen that, that's the psychological, that's the thinking mind, as opposed to the working mind, which doesn't cause any problem for our peace of mind. It doesn't get in the way of our peace of mind. And so, to the extent that the intellectual understanding, which is in the working mind, right, it's in the functional side, to the extent that the intellectual understanding starts to recognize the conditioning, which we're calling the thinking mind, it then knows it for what it is. So it is the working mind that starts catching out the thinking mind and allowing the thinking mind to be there, but knowing what it is. It's genes and up-to-date conditioning functioning. And to the extent that the working mind just lets that be, that is non-doership in action. So it's not resisting the thinking mind for being there. And that is wisdom.
So is the working mind different than the witness when it's watching the thinking mind? It's a little different.
It is a little different, yeah. So the witness is more akin to the function of awareness. Witnessing and awareness doesn't do any thinking. Witnessing and awareness is aware of both the thinking mind and the working mind. The working mind, so on its own, awareness doesn't understand what the thinking mind is, for example. Awareness is just witnessing it. The working mind will see the thinking mind, understand that, that's what causes suffering. Hopefully the working mind won't try and do anything to the thinking mind, but the thinking mind might actually then grab hold of that and say, I'm going to stop the thinking mind. I should stop the thinking. That's the thinking mind again. The doer. So really, I wouldn't expect anyone, or not anyone, but there's so many little distinctions. When I say so many, not that many that it's impossible. There's a lot of different distinctions, but once our intellect, which is part of the working mind, the thinking mind is part of our intellect, but it's the intellect that's got things wrong. When the working mind starts understanding these concepts, it starts working on its own. And so that's why watching and re-listening to satsangs over and over is new conditioning. And at some point we find, I don't know who said it, someone said it here, that they can actually repeat what I'm about to say next. And I can relate to that. When I was at Ramesh's, I listened to the teaching so much that I knew everything that was going to be said to a certain question, let's say, or what was going to come next. It's probably why I'm able to talk about it like this now. But that going deeper and deeper and investigating life, which is not an investigation that, you don't have to think, okay, how do I investigate it? It's just the understanding starts seeing life. That's pleasure, that's pain, that's suffering, that's the absence of suffering, that's blame, that's guilt, that's pride, that's rivalry, seeing the other as a competitor or a rival, seeing that anxiety is based on a belief that I am going to be killed at any instant, or something has gone wrong in life and I'm just waiting to find out about it, and say, that's based on my belief in attachment to outcomes. So that's how the investigation happens, and we might realize, it's not something I'm not investigating.
There's a lot of talk about like when the mind comes in alignment with the heart, it can be used by the heart, or it's sort of like that. In this, would it be like when, like, the working mind's like an interpreter?
Yeah. When the mind is conditioned in a healthy way, then it becomes a very valuable tool. It becomes valuable because the mind is such that it is aligned with the heart, which is more a representation of what is. So the heart refers to being and what is. And so the working mind can actually start to be programmed where it is accurately enough conditioned to see things as they are. Pleasure, pain, suffering, peace. And it becomes a very useful tool. So this is the thing, make no mistake, in the path of jnana yoga, it is concepts that bring about change. The change is on the level of the intellect. The part of the intellect that changes is the intellect that has got it wrong, which is effectively the thinking mind. Consciousness itself doesn't grow. Consciousness doesn't develop. So the process is not us becoming more conscious. It's simply the obstacles that are in the way of being falling away. And so the change in jnana yoga is always a change on the level of the intellect.
Okay, so like the thinking mind has a tremendous amount of momentum, and it seems that it kind of gets more and more momentum in me when emotion's added to it, and it kind of links up with the emotion, and then it builds and builds. And it's like goes rogue. It's like, and I can see that it's doing that, and I can feel the emotion that's rising. But it's not necessarily stopping. But when you catch it early and you use one of these concepts, then the story doesn't get to have, it's like kind of like, Hollywood producer saying, no, we're not going to have that movie. We're not going to fund that movie being made. And then there's not as much suffering. But
yeah, it's, to me, when the suffering, when pain in the moment is delivered, the doership is forced to kick into action, and how long the suffering is going to be and how intense it's going to be and what cuts it off, all part of the unfolding story of life. So sometimes it's destined for the suffering to get cut off. At other times, it's destined for the suffering to become very intense, which really means the doer aspect just goes berserk and says, no, you are the doer, and this is unacceptable. And there's just no clarity to the contrary. And so intense emotion of blame, let's say, is doership, it is suffering. And when that's happening, there's no clarity and no capacity for it to seem like it's not relevant. It seems very relevant. And at some point it gets cut off. And then we might look back and go, that was very strange. I don't believe now, I don't see that issue as a big deal. But in the moment, it was. And so that's the process. The process is, as the intellectual understanding goes deeper and deeper, we find suffering starts getting cut off quicker and quicker and quicker. So it might start off getting cut off at a count of 10. That could be 10 hours. And then the understanding goes deeper and we find suffering arises and gets cut off at the count of 6. And then at some point we find it gets cut off at the count of 3 or 1. And when the understanding is total, we find that the suffering doesn't even arise.
that's when you don't believe in a doer anymore. When the suffering doesn't arise, then you know that not you, but you. Obviously you wouldn't know that.
No,
because that'd be the doer.
You just know that the belief in doership has dissolved. So to the extent suffering arises, objectively we can say, suffering arises because the belief in doership still exists somewhere. Not as my doing, hopefully the intellectual understanding hopefully understands not my doing. And there can be a relaxation into the fact, yes, there is suffering because a certain belief system exists.
What about the topic of spiritual bypassing? I wondered I was really interested in some Facebook posts you had and just in general what you think of like using the concepts to kind of cut off the story so you don't have to feel what is in your body to like a trauma or something like that, and how to kind of unlock that so that what you shared earlier, you don't carry that into the next data stream of your next life, or what, not yours, but.
So spiritual bypassing refers to a dynamic that happens when a set of beliefs are put in place, and those beliefs generally come as a result of concepts delivered in certain teachings. And so the problem is not the concepts, but the problem is how the concepts are interpreted and held by the person that has heard them. So a spiritual teaching will deliver concepts that, if held correctly, are usually very powerful at undoing certain dynamics. But because of the way that the human is designed to tend to treat a concept as something that might be true, we are prone to turning the teaching into a new belief. So an example of that could be none of this is real. It's a concept that says all of life is an illusion, none of it is real. And if that concept hits correctly, if it lands correctly, it can serve to shift our perspective from seeing this as an objective reality to seeing it as something that is less objective, something that arises and collapses, a spontaneous an experience in the present moment. If, however, it's grabbed onto by the doer, or turned into a belief, in other words, we might go around saying, oh, none of this is real as a belief, which means that we're essentially creating a divide between ourself and life because of a belief that is not relating to life accurately. And that belief, a feeling might arise inside of us, and the thought can come up on, this is not real. And instead of cutting off the feeling, as in dissolving it, what it is creating is creating a mental movement that is suppressing what is, or turning and looking in the other direction. So we go, no, doesn't exist, not real. Which is very different to seeing something as unreal and it fading away. And bypassing, I guess, is what we've always done in life, is we've figured these feelings are very uncomfortable, and the best thing to do is to suppress them. And spirituality, spiritual pointers are saying suppressing is not the solution. Suppressing might be a temporary solution to feeling better, but whatever we suppress is going to come back and pervade our life and make the whole life experience much worse. So at some point, spiritual pointers are saying you have to go and look at what has been locked away. And that can feel uncomfortable. And so the spiritual concept might be or one of the strategies employed by the old way of dealing with life is to use a spiritual concept to do the same thing, to suppress, but at the same time convincing us that we're not suppressing. So it makes us feel like what I'm doing is wisdom. This is what the teaching has told me. So it's wisdom. But what we've done is we've turned the pointer into a very handy concept that allows us to suppress again. And so at some point we start feeling that this doesn't feel right. How I'm relating to life, something's a bit off. And that becomes the hint that maybe we've turned the concept into a spiritual bypass, meaning an unwillingness to look at something.
So for me, when I'm looking at something and it's really like an intense feeling of, I don't know, sadness or anger or, and I know it's like, okay, I go to food now, I'm using a concept, or I'm just using Satsang. I'll YouTube on, okay, zone out on that. And it's higher, it's higher than going to food or, substance or wanting love or whatever. But it's not, it feels like it is anyway, but it's not feeling the feeling. So the one time I just sat all day and let every feeling come, they came and I just stayed, and then they just kind of disappeared. Like, I just waited for them like they were, house guests or whatever. And yet that still doesn't keep it, like that's still not quite it. It feels like, because it just can't, it's not this, is there something I'm missing in terms of resolving? Because I know the past doesn't exist. So things that caused me pain in the past are just in the body, right? Because it's only now. Is this making sense?
Sure, yeah. They're belief systems about who I am based on past events.
So if it's only now, then whatever happened, if it's coming up now, means that it's locked in the body.
Mm-hmm.
So I have to come into the body in order to be in the I am, but in order to feel comfortable to come in the body, to know the feeling of I am or the home of I am, I have to deal with the rocks or the clutter in the room,
Mm-hmm.
which are these things coming up. So I'm just wondering if there's any up-to-date conditioning you could give me regarding how to deal with, other than just staying as the awareness, welcoming the feelings to come when they come, and then feeling the feeling. That's it? It's simple like that?
Well, there's a whole mix of things. Spiritual bypassing means where we take the concept and it gets sort of taken into a place that is not that healthy, and that will start to feel that. So if we start to feel something's not right, the understanding hopefully will catch any bypassing if it's happening. So we don't need to worry too much. When it starts to happen, then it'll get caught. The reason I say that is that a lot of using the concepts correctly also includes the same sort of thinking that could turn into spiritual bypassing. But at first, it's not spiritual bypassing. It's actually the concept starting to work. Like, my happiness isn't to be found in the flow of life can either be wisdom or it can turn into a spiritual bypassing. Then we need to understand that there's witnessing everything as a happening. That's very important, to find ourselves seeing everything that happens in the flow of life, pleasure and pain, the suffering if it arises, as a biological and psychological reaction, part of the experience, and it's witnessed. Not witnessed by Roger the body, but witnessed by that formless awareness that witnesses. Sometimes, though, we become overly obsessed with witnessing to a point where it in itself can become unhealthy. Because witnessing tends to mean that we don't feel the uncomfortable feelings. And so we find that witnessing happens from time to time, and the uncomfortable feelings dissolve. And because witnessing is spoken about so often, we can maybe conclude, witnessing is the solution. The solution is to witness everything. What witnessing tends to do is tends to prevent us from really feeling deeply all of the components, because witnessing will dissolve certain feelings. If they dissolve, we can't investigate them, we can't feel them. And so at first we think, but all I need is for them to dissolve. Who cares about investigating them? If they dissolve, that's great. It's true, when we witness and they dissolve, that's peace. The problem is they keep coming back. And so then we have to keep working hard at dissolving them by being the witness all the time. At some point, life might produce some new conditioning that says, yes, witnessing is very important because it allows us to ground into our true nature and understand that. But there's a time when we have to put witnessing aside and actually really feel the energies. Allow what feels completely unenlightened, extreme blame, extreme sadness, to come to the surface. And in doing that, we'll start to understand the dynamics of doership that are at place, the hatred towards the other, for example, in intense blame that has been locked away a long time ago. And if we're just witnessing, we don't get to feel that because the blame will maybe dissolve. So to hear that, it's very valid also to put witnessing aside and just feel fully the feelings. And then when the feelings develop, we start to see the storyline in those feelings. The story of guilt, blame, pride, worry, expectation. And in understanding that, we might be surprised, wow, I can really feel this intense hatred. I've I've always pushed it away. And to the extent that we feel it and we go, wow, this is intense. And then we see, yes, it's a story of doership and attachment to outcomes. And it can develop, it can flower more and more to the point where we express it. We say, I'm not worried about being enlightened in this moment. I'm just interested in being authentic to the feeling and honoring the feeling. And that can be, you can call that a cathartic release, right? You start shouting, hitting the pillow, crying, whatever. You don't have to do it to the person that there is hatred for. That's not important. Let it out. And to the extent it gets let out with an understanding that what is getting let out is an energy that was locked away based on an attitude to life that was there when this event happened a long time ago. It's not how I consciously see life anymore. And that means I understand why that hatred is there. I understand where it came from. I understand why it was locked in place. And now I'm willing to express it in a way that I didn't express in the past. And that expression of it with the conscious understanding of that being a sort of way in which life could be seen, but not how I now see it, that's a releasing of it.
And then it doesn't come back.
Well, you don't necessarily release it all in one sitting necessarily, but as this feeling and releasing happens more and more of the energy is released. And so what is released doesn't come back, but there could be some left over. And each time we see it and it gets released, the load is less and less.
And then you're more empty?
Exactly, yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Choice. We haven't spoken about choice. Decisions, decision making. So the idea is that we still need to live life, seeing that everything is predetermined based on my genes and up-to-date conditioning doesn't mean that I don't need to make choice. And sometimes the idea of not being in control is mistaken for choice. So it's like someone says, I can't make a choice because I'm not the doer and I'm not in control. And that happens when we mistake the word choice, like I have a choice to make, with control. And so choice in the way that it's normally defined as my choice, I as the doer choosing, that's not what we mean by choice now. Choice simply refers to the mechanics of one option that presents itself, one of many options that present themselves in this moment, being picked. So if we find ourselves in a restaurant and we get given a menu and there's 10 items on the menu, we will look at the items on the menu and based on our preferences in that moment, one of the options will get picked. And so that point of an option being picked is what we're calling choice. But according to the concepts, that choice was predetermined to be made. And so often when someone understands this, they, what I used to think is my choice is all predetermined. And so then they might say, well, I have no choice. And it's much better to say you have no control over what is predetermined, but what is predetermined unfolds according to choice in the moment. And so if we can see that we are always making choices throughout the day, but those choices are much less my choice than I might have previously believed. My choice meaning me as a separate independent entity, choosing of my own free will and volition. When we check out what happens, a choice is picked based on who we are, including primarily our biological preferences at that point in time. And that is based on my genes and up-to-date conditioning. And so the choice is determined by two factors that I wasn't in control of, and the outcome of that choice, not in my control. Sometimes I get what I want, sometimes I don't get what I want. And Ramesh would say sometimes you get much more than you want, or much less. So we can see that I made a choice. I picked orange juice based on the circumstance, which includes the menu with orange juice as an option, and my genes and up-to-date conditioning. My genes and up-to-date conditioning might mean circumstance, orange juice isn't on the menu, but I say, well, I'm going to ask for it anyway. So that is the choice in the moment. And then we place the order with the waiter, and he comes back and says, I'm very sorry, there's no orange juice in the kitchen, so you can't have orange juice. So choice was made based on my genes and up-to-date conditioning that I had no control over, and the outcome not in my control. And yet, if I'm looking at life objectively, is there choice or not? In practice, 1 of 10 options is picked at a particular point in time. That is what we are calling the decision or the choice. And as long as we see it clearly, that it is a choice, choice really means 1 of many options being picked, but it's much less my choice than I would have thought.
So, awareness has been landing on these teachings for about 7 months. And I guess a lot has clicked during that time. And I feel really fortunate about that. And a couple weeks ago, I was fortunate again to land in a situation where what I always believed as what little remained was basically cleared up. And but there was still something that said the true test is not going to be found in Satsang, and it's not going to be found away from the daily challenges. If there seemed to be some proof that was required still, go home and go to work and deal with family and see if the suffering doesn't arise, or if it does arise. And it had already diminished in the last months, the arising and the intensity of the arising. But so there was a test seemed to have to happen, I guess, for lack of a better way of putting it. And then so that's 2 weeks of the test, and I found that there was no suffering arising during the 2 weeks. But then something else, another qualifier came up. It wasn't enough. And it's pretty simple, I guess, but it seemed like, everything is exactly the same. Like, not just that pleasure and pain still arise, but apart from, and this is not to be taken lightly, but apart from the lack of suffering, which is in itself, it's a profound thing, that that suffering hasn't been arising, that it's not arising. I mean, the understanding of the value of that, it's pretty deep. So, but apart from that, everything is exactly the same, like exactly. And I just wanted, I guess that last qualifier was to check with you on that, if that's a description you would agree with.
That everything is exactly the same.
Yes.
Everything meaning each moment. So,
Go ahead.
no, yeah. It's better if you elaborate.
Just, like I say, it can't be, I can't express it enough. This, aside from the lack of suffering, okay? Let's just say, which is huge. So, let's say, if we were to describe liberation, that would be enough of a description.
Mm-hmm.
And that, but life is still, and this sounds more kindergarten description, but it's still, every single challenge is the same, every single situation is the same, every single interaction is they're the same. It's the same life being lived.
Mm-hmm.
Like, precisely the same. Just never, nothing's arising to create discomfort, you know?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But it doesn't have a, I know from this teaching that, so I don't, it's not going to be a sustained, because different states have happened as awareness has continued to land on the concepts, and the concepts have done their work, not by my doing, but and you've said it here today, and that I think there were definitely times where I thought, this is it. I'm going to remain in this witnessing state.
Mm-hmm.
Or I've had some experiences where I think I mentioned to you before, where it was like a bliss feeling, or really of just a deep peace feeling that lasted for like 4 or 5 days. But this is not that.
Mm.
I don't have witnessing anymore like that. I don't have any deep peace feeling anymore.
Mm-hmm.
I certainly don't have any feeling of bliss. I just have the lack of suffering, which is great,
Mhm.
but there's nothing additional. There's nothing. It's just daily life.
Mhm.
Plug it away.
So I'm not sure why, because what you say that it's seen to be all the same means that we understand the fundamental nature of life is experience, let's say, and there's a groundedness in being that which sort of is unchanging in the experience, and so the content in each moment could be different. So it can seem like it's different, but we see the fundamental sameness of each moment. That in theory it's like, yeah, different pleasure, different pain, different content, but it's not really different. It's the same. It's pleasure or pain, and awareness is the same. And so on the one hand, everything's changing, but actually it's, especially relative to who I am, it's the same. And so I think there's a lot of insights that come along the way, all of which accumulate to deliver this peace. And so I can't fault at all what you're saying, but I would suspect that because it's one of, let's say, the last insights, it seems more relevant in a sense than it might in some time. And so in practical terms, the description that I would give is the end of suffering, in practice, which you've acknowledged for sure. And so what you've described is very insightful. It's absolutely right. The recognition that everything in life, that each life experience is same but different. Different in content, but fundamentally it's experience. And what I am is fundamentally unaffected by that and always the same. I'm not convinced that it's important to include that as a description of liberation. But then again, let's not get carried away. Even a description, like, we don't need it, because the feeling or the experience is self-contenting. It's the experience itself that is what we're looking for, right? The peace.
It's sufficient to bring about peace. Then, I don't know. You said that earlier about
so
some
to
things.
just be the peace, to just in a way, sometimes we think that describing it or talking about it is important, and I understand it is important to, as part of the process, to do whatever needs to be to honor the feeling, to talk about it. Let's say, at some point we realize actually, it is self-contenting.
Yeah.
And I just need to be it. And then we don't even need to describe it, in a sense, or put it into words. But why it's so important to put it into words is from a teaching point of view, let's say, is in case someone is running around with an elaborate idea of what it is, an elaborate idea of what in this liberation feels like or looks like. And so from that point of view, I would say, actually, in practical terms, it's simply the end of suffering, which, when suffering is there, compared to when it's not there, we get to see what a gift that is, and how underestimated the mind, how easily it's underestimated. So in practice, when suffering is not there on a continuous, unbroken basis, you know, what more could I ask for? Is that fair?
No, thanks for the answer. I appreciate it.
Let me just clarify. Are you pointing at the fact that, as well as the absence of suffering, I can't deny that there is a presence of something, like a presence of being? Because
Okay.
what I heard you say is that there is no suffering, and that is, the jewel in the crown, let's say.
Mm-hmm.
But
Just to clarify, it's a dangerous. Only for a period of time, a couple of weeks. If we're looking at time and space and all that, it's not that long. So, go. Well, now that I've interrupted you, just thought. So, it's when you're saying about the being. So, there was a period where some of the experiences that occurred were like a deep feeling of when you describe resting and being, that's what I believe was being felt. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And then sometimes like a real, like a void, like emptiness that was so empty that, there's just nothing, it couldn't be described, but just a feeling. And it felt like, that's like peace. It felt, so, but then the descriptions that I've heard from you is that at some point, we come back and to basically to daily living and to participating as if we have free will, and so that's what's happening. But that doesn't include any of it's just pure that without suffering,
Mm-hmm.
not including, any profound feeling of emptiness, not including even what for a period was like a certain sense that I had that I felt was in line with your description of resting and being.
Mm-hmm.
Like, not that those things are absolutely off but that's, in general, the frequency has gone down of the experiences that were validating what the descriptions
Mm-hmm.
would be to what's going to be happening.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, the suffering was also going down. So that's what my question was based on. Is that line up, or does that not line up?
No, what you've just said now lines up perfectly. But what you said before seemed to be, yes, there's no suffering. That's then no additional anything, just no suffering.
Yeah.
But it was like, but I need to also say it's all the same, right? And I was wondering why why it was important to say, but it's all the same, because what you've just described now at the end here is, wow, any subtle states or even awareness of being, all of that fades away.
Mm-hmm.
I completely agree. And what is left behind is very ordinary living, doing whatever needs to be done according to your life circumstance, pleasure and pain still happening, and no suffering.
Yeah. Yeah, like, I guess when I was saying that, so maybe I'm not that good with words, but there's a feeling of normal.
Mm-hmm.
A normalcy, an ordinary. It's so ordinary and so normal and so.
Oh, the same. I see. You mean the same
like,
as it normally is. Let's say
the same as things normally would be
Yes, okay.
almost like when I was feeling suffering regularly,
Good.
but there's just
Glad-
no suffering. Is
Glad we
that-
cleared that up. Yes.
Okay.
Okay. Good. Yes, it's exact. That's it. We expect there to be some radical, because we hear about the shifts in different experiences of oneness so much. And that's the point, is that what are we really looking for? We're looking for happiness. Happiness is the end of suffering. So then we can drop this idea we're looking for particular states and all that. And I'm sure that that's how this has ended up coming about. Well, I'm sure, but you might like to say that those other expectations probably were getting in the way at some point, and the process needed to dissolve them. And then what happens is, once it's not about something special, what it is about gets to be there, goes through the process, and it really is about, all I really want is happiness, and happiness comes in such an ordinary, simple form. It comes in the form of me being Brandon, Roger, Brandon. In the form of being Roger, being Brandon. No special state, no oneness experience. Doing what I always do, and simply realizing that the old habit of suffering arising no longer happens. And if we look at it, it's probably because we say, the process dissolved by showing them to be false or erroneous, dissolved a whole lot of beliefs.
Thank you.
Thank you for sharing. This is very good news.
Is there a feeling that goes along with that or not?
Let's just say that the end of suffering is, in practical terms, the most accurate way of describing it, and putting it into negative form, i.e. talking about what is not there, is more significant than talking about what is there if something is there. And I can't, if I was going to answer it in the positive form, it's very hard, because what is there is the awareness of what's not there, in a sense. If there is a feeling, it's a feeling of spaciousness or emptiness, openness. And so, describing spaciousness, emptiness, openness as a feeling is... This is the paradoxical nature of this, of life at this subtle level. There is, to some extent, there's a very subtle presence, let's say, but that is not so different to the presence that was always there, the sense of I am Roger, before, when all of the beliefs were in place, was actually a result of the presence of the impersonal consciousness. And so then that presence is here, maybe it's more recognized, but we can't even say that it's that different to what it was before. The significant thing to point at is the absence, just the non-arising of suffering.
I get some feeling in my heart.
Yeah, there are a lot of. It's a process. It's a movement, and at different times, along with the absence of suffering, there are a lot of things that seem to be present. And what tends to happen, it's worth noticing this if it's accurate, see if it's an accurate thing, is that yes, something is present for a period of time, and then it sort of falls away, and something else takes its place another feeling. Let's say we might feel the heart at one point, and then at some other point we might feel more witnessing, let's say. And at the time that the witnessing is there, we might say, oh, it's the absence of suffering, but it's also the presence of witnessing. But we might realize, oh, but a month before we might have said it's the absence of suffering, but the presence of centralization in the heart. And because those things keep changing, and eventually they might even fade away, and it's none of those, then we go, oh, actually the lowest common denominator that was there all the time, once it is there, is the end of suffering. And then I can talk about the other things as states or experiences that come and go. For a while, if they're there while they're present, maybe we're not so aware of the fact that certain parts of the experience are coming and going and are not ever present. And so that's why I'm confident to say that accurate description of the stabilized freedom is the end of suffering. And Buddha, in the way I saw Buddhism, what stood out to me a long time ago was enlightenment is the end of suffering. Didn't say enlightenment is bliss or enlightenment is knowing oneself. Enlightenment is the end of suffering. And the cause of suffering is desire. So it makes sense that if enlightenment is the end of suffering, the cause of suffering is desire, then enlightenment means the end of desire. And that's what we're talking about here, the end of the belief that my happiness is to be found in pleasure, 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 which allows a connection to self to happen. So we can also say, oh, the cause of enlightenment or the cause of the end of suffering is knowing oneself. Then we start getting a little esoteric. So in practical terms, it's the end of suffering. But there's also going to be lots of other stuff. But that's additional, let's say.
I'd like to hear a little bit about your perspective on the role of the guru in awakening.
Okay. The guru. So, what often happens is we have ideas about a lot of things, and a teacher, a guru, the process is something we definitely can have ideas about. So, someone asked me, "Am I a guru?" And on one level, or teacher, same thing. And I don't have a preconception in my head, this is what I am. But the fact is, on a practical level, if you find yourself working in a garden all day, and someone says, "What are you?" I can say, "Oh, I'm a gardener." Right? But I understand that what I am is not defined by being a gardener. So if I can say I'm a gardener in practical terms, I'm just saying, what I spend my day doing is working in a garden, so I'm a gardener. But hopefully I don't mistake myself for being identified with that. So yes, I would say that I am a teacher in a sense that this activity is what spiritual teaching looks like. And really, so what do I see that I'm doing? I'm not giving anyone anything that they don't have, except for a set of pointers. And even that is not me giving anything to anyone. It's life unfolding through this body-mind organism and not my doing. I couldn't utter a single word on my own. So everything that happens is a happening, and I feel like I'm being lived. Meaning that whatever happens through me is exactly that, a happening through me. And so I don't have any expectations of what happens as a result of the spiritual teaching, knowing that that's out of my control, and definitely don't feel like I have any power over anyone. So that's why at the beginning it's said, don't take any of this as truth. They're only pointers. See if they resonate, see if they become part of your up-to-date conditioning, and then very importantly, test them out for yourself. And when you test them out for yourself, it becomes your own truth. And so from that point of view, all a teacher is doing is what they're destined to do, and they don't give anyone anything except for some pointers that say, look there and see what's there. And look there, see what's there. And the pointers can say, there is an apple on the table in the corner of the room. And your job is to look in the corner of the room. So my job is to point at the apple on the table in the corner of the room, and then the seeker hopefully looks. And that way it becomes clear, the teacher hasn't given me the apple. The teacher has just told me where the apple is. And what we're really pointing at is our self. So that's what I think the role is.
I guess with, some of the kind of more avatarish embodiments, where there's, it's not kind of jnana yoga, it's more of a kind of a devotional thing.
Mm-hmm.
And there's some mystery or some grace. I mean, that same grace is working through everything, but it seems more apparent when you're around those people.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess I've been an avid seeker, and I have entertained many different directions, and it's all useful, and it all comes to the same place. And I don't know, there's still a unknowing or a curiosity around. I don't even know really what I'm asking for, but do you get a sense of the question that I'm not even really speaking? Like, is there any do you from this kind of more jnana yoga path, do you see that as another path that has its own mechanism?
Sure. Each path, each teaching is a methodology that's specifically geared for a specific personality type and certain ways that the error gets put in place. And so different teachers will be given different characteristics, different attributes that are more suited to a particular type of methodology. And so when you look at teachers that emanate a lot of Shakti energy, that in a way is there to attract people that need something a little more enticing to hang around. And so they are attracted by the energy, let's say, in order for them to be there long enough for the concepts to be delivered, or for them to have a reason to follow some other instruction, let's say. So devotional teachings may require the teacher to take on a different perspective, where they do get put on a pedestal, for example. And the hope is that a teacher that's in that role internally understands that they are no different from those people around them that are idolizing them, and yet find that their personality allows themselves to step up onto a pedestal, knowing that it's just a role. And to the extent that a teacher gets put on a pedestal and they think they deserve to be put on a pedestal, then some unfavorable things can happen. All of which part of the flow of life destiny, and it happens. So, are there any last minute burning questions for anyone, particularly who's not going to be here tomorrow? Thank you.